Good morning, guys. As you saw, tomorrow we honor Memorial Day. And so I want to take you through some of Memorial Day. And with Memorial Day, there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of biblical history as well. And so going to Memorial Day, it is very different from what we have with Veterans Day. On Veterans Day, literally, we honor all who serve. But on Memorial Day, we particularly look at those who sacrificed their lives, those who gave their lives. And in the history of America, as you look back over our history, we've had about 57 million Americans over our history who have served in the military, who've been willing to die for us and our country. And we have 19 million of them still alive today. There have been 45 million Americans who served in a time of war when we were under attack. And there's 15 million of those alive today. But out of all of our history, 300 years or so of our history, we have 1.4 million who have sacrificed their lives, and that's what Memorial Day is to honor and remember those, that 1.4 million. So when you look at that 1.4 million, and we look at Memorial Day tomorrow, we only do this once a year, and it's a good time to remember some key principles that go with it. I'm going to tell you a lot of stories that go with it as well. There's a lot of people opposed to the military even today. There's a lot of anti-war. And their perspective is, look, wars are bad, which they are. And if you didn't have soldiers, you wouldn't have war, because soldiers lead to wars. And so if you didn't have military, and so they're anti-military being anti-war, and we all want peace. There's no question about that. But being anti-military, that's kind of like saying, you know what? If there were no cops, there would be no crime. That's a silly notion. That's not the way it works. Getting rid of the military, getting rid of soldiers, it's not what stops war. It's a heart condition. Jesus said there would be wars and rumors of wars. So when you look literally at it, I think it's interesting that they say, read the Bible. Perfect instruction. We ought to be doing that all the time for everything anyway. So if we read the Bible and look into the Bible, let's start with Exodus 15:3. This is what the scripture says. It says, the Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. The Lord's a man of war? I don't think that was the part of the Bible they wanted us to read. But that is part of what the scripture says. As a matter of fact, let me just take you through several scriptures. Isaiah 13:3, I have commanded my holy ones. I have summoned my warriors. The Lord Almighty is mustering an army for war. You have scriptures also like 1 Chronicles. In 1 Chronicles 5:22, it says, for there fell down many slain, because the war was of God. How is that possible? See, this is not what many people study in the scriptures, but it's always important to go back to the scriptures and see what the scriptures say. And then even New Testament-wise, in Revelation 19:11, this involves every one of us. After Christ returns and we're joined to him, we're told in Revelation 19:11 that I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on him was called Faithful and True. And in righteousness, he judges and makes war. We're all part of that at that point in time. That's part of what happens when he returns. So with all of this going on, I mean, it is important to read the Bible, but let's not stop there. Let's go back to, for example, when you go back to Exodus 14. This is where God had, through the 10 miracles, saved his people. He's led them out. An army is trying to destroy his people. And God himself sovereignly destroys all of the Egyptian army to save his people. Miracle. God performed a miracle in war. If he is that opposed to war, why would he perform miracles as something he opposed? Because war is not always bad. We'll get to that in a moment too, from a biblical standpoint. If you look at what happened over in Exodus 17, after God gets his people and he says, I have a promised land for you to go into, they have to fight the Amalekites. The Amalekites say, we don't want you to have what God promised for you. And so Moses is fighting the Amalekites, and as long as he's able to hold his hands up, he defeats the enemy. But he gets tired throughout the day and his hands come down. So you see on the right is Aaron, on the left is Hur. They hold his hands up, and as long as his hands are up, they prevail over the Amalekites, and he defeats the Amalekites. It was a God intervention in that battle. You also have with Joshua 6, it was God himself who knocked down the walls so that the enemy could be destroyed. If you move into Joshua 10, Joshua is fighting the Amorites, and it's a hard battle, and it's gone hard for Israel all day. But as the day is drawing to a close, the battle tide is turning. They're starting to defeat the Amorites, and Joshua said, man, this is a bad time for sunset to come because we're now starting to get the upper hand. If we could just have more light. And so he prays, and God holds, the Bible says that God held the sun still for a day. And they had an extra day of daylight. So what would be all through the night is still daylight, and they're able to defeat the Amorites. It's a divine miracle that God performed to help that army, to help them defeat an enemy that needed to be defeated. Then you have Genesis 11, where we're introduced to Abraham. And a couple chapters later, the king of Sodom attacks Abraham and goes after Abraham and takes his family and takes his family members and takes his possessions. And so Abraham gets together his army, and he pursues the king of Sodom and is able to defeat the king of Sodom. He gets all his family back, all his family members, all his stuff back. And then on coming back with all the spoils of war, he meets Melchizedek. Melchizedek is high priest. As a matter of fact, theologically, it's believed that Melchizedek may have been the appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament, because it talks about Jesus was part of the order of the high priest Melchizedek. And so people say, well, that was the first appearance of Jesus, and that was in the Old Testament. And Abraham kneels down to him and honors him and gives him the tithes of war, the 10%, the tithe. So the tithes, the first tithe ever given was the tithe of war. This was before the law was given. So you look at that and you say, wow, Jesus was involved in that, or that's what theologians believe is all the way back there. So there's so many places you can go. We have so many of the heroes of the Bible. David and Goliath, he was a great warrior. He brought peace to the kingdom. He preserved God's people from all the people who wanted to destroy them. You have Bible verse after Bible verse after Bible verse. So when you read the Bible, you find out God is not anti-war. He's not pro-war, but he's willing to use war because that's part of human nature, and he makes sure that the right prevails over the wrong. And that's just part of what, and that's why you have to have a military. If you don't have a military, that does not mean you don't get attacked. As a matter of fact, that's how we got into World War II. We'll cover that later. We believe after World War I, it was called the war to end all wars. If we do not militarize ourselves, we will never again be attacked because we're a threat to no one. And so after World War I, we did not militarize ourselves. We were still flying, when World War II broke out, we were still flying biplanes from World War I, because our belief was if you don't threaten anybody, they'll leave you alone. That didn't work out. That's not what happened, because there are always nations that will attack you. There's always nations that want to destroy. They work with their father, Satan, who wants to kill, steal, and destroy. That's always there. So you always have to have the good to be able to push back on that. So when you read the Bible, you find that in the Bible, there's a lot of references to war. And we have what are called biblically just wars and biblically unjust. Not every war is right, and God's not going to bless the way people fight in certain wars. Certain wars are unjust, certain wars are just. What's the difference? And by the way, this used to be a big deal for the early church fathers. Like you go back to St. Augustine. He spent a lot of time going through the Bible and what it says about soldiers and conflict and war, etc., and came up with writings, extensive writings about what is a biblically just war and what's a biblically unjust war. How do you know the difference? What makes a war just or unjust? Same thing even 1,000 years later with St. Thomas Aquinas. Even today, in our military academies, we use their theological writings to help us understand what is right and what is wrong in times of war. This is what the Bible gives guidance on. Every aspect of life, the Bible gives clear guidance on. So a biblically just war, when you look within that framework of a biblically just war, if you are in a biblically just war, this is when soldiers can say, Psalm 144:1, it says, "Praise be to the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle." Being a soldier is a gifting of God when it's used in the right direction. And this is what we see in the scriptures, passages like this. David, who was a great warrior, wrote this as a psalm of praise to God. It is God who trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle. So that comes on a just war side, which is important for us to consider. So when you look at American history, I want to take you through some stories where that just wars were occurring and God performed miraculous interventions in the midst of just wars. There are some awesome stories out of American history. And I want to take us back to 1755. Actually, it's a war that goes from 1753 to 1763. It's a 10-year war, but it's called the French and Indian War. And this is the war where the nation is first introduced to a kid named George Washington. He's a 23-year-old kid. Nobody knows anything about him except his neighbors in Virginia. And in this particular battle, which goes for 10 years, what you had was along the coast of America, you had the Americans and their Indian allies, and they were all British. We were British at that time, so you have the British, the American, the Indian allies, and over in the center of the country, you have the French and their Indian allies. And the French decide that they want the land that the English have. And so the French and the Indians from the west attack over into English land, and the battleground is Virginia. Now, if you can see that map up there, that looks like no shape of Virginia you've ever seen in your life. That is a weird shaped Virginia because back then, Virginia included much of Pennsylvania, much of Ohio, the Ohio Valley. It was really weird shape. But the French have said, we want all of this stuff that the English have. And so at that point in time, the British sent General Edward Braddock to America with a bunch of ships loaded with troops and said, we're not going to let the French take that from us. And so as the Americans and French get together, as the Americans and the English get together with our Indian allies, we go to shove the French and their allies out of there. And so it ends up being a massive line. It's 4 miles long. The line of soldiers going to fight in this war is 4 miles long. And George Washington is a 23-year-old young colonel out of the Virginia militia, and he tells General Braddock, he said, General, we're in America. This is really different from the battles you fight over in Europe. You see, over here, when we fight with Indians, our side, their side, we often have ambushes, and we often have all these unexpected battles, and Bradford says, what a cowardly way to fight. If you're a man, you walk out in the open and fight. Well, because he rejected what Washington warned him about, he led his troops into an ambush, and it was a major ambush. When that ambush started from the French and Indians, there were 86 British and American officers in that battle. At the end of the battle, and by the way, all 86 officers were targeted by the enemy because they recognized if you can wipe out the officers, you can scatter all the troops, a lot easier to kill. So 86 British American officers, they singled out every officer, including General Braddock, including George Washington. They singled them out. Every single mounted officer was shot down off his horse except George Washington. He's the only one that's remaining. And so Braddock and when Braddock falls and Braddock is shot down, Washington took charge. He took the remaining troops. It was a slaughter. He took the remaining troops that were left and he got them back away from the battle zone. They arrived back at a place called Fort Cumberland, Maryland, and arrived back there, and word is spread across America. They've all been killed. Everybody was wiped out. There was not a survivor. And so Washington gets back and he writes his family. He said, you've been told that I was killed. He said, I haven't been killed. And this is the testimony he gives. He says, I now exist and appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of providence. He says that prevented me beyond all human probability or expectation. He says, I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt. I took my jacket off after the battle and I had bullet holes in my jacket, but nothing touched me. He said, I lost horse. I said, I clearly was targeted. And what's interesting is that's an interesting story at that point in time, but it's a miraculous intervention, but it's hard for Washington to recognize that, but other people did. For example, Samuel Davies recognized how miraculous it was. Samuel Davies is a famous preacher back then. He's part of the First Great Awakening with George Whitefield and all those other guys. And now that America is at war, he preaches a deployment sermon. There's a group of soldiers leaving from his area of Virginia going to fight against the French and the Indians. And so he gives this deployment sermon, and in the sermon, he has a little footnote at the bottom here. And this little footnote, he says, by the way, we've all heard about this young kid named George Washington. We've all heard that this miraculous intervention. And he points out, he says, this is what God will do for soldiers. He says, there's a remarkable instance of this. I may point out to the public that heroic youth, Colonel Washington, whom I cannot but hope providence has hitherto preserved in so signal a manner for some important service to his country. When we see God intervene with a miracle like that, God probably has something special planned for this kid. We need to keep our eyes on him. He may be special someday. Now see, this is before anybody knew who George Washington was. And so this miracle, that's part of the sermon. He said, this is what God will do for soldiers when they fight in a righteous cause and a just cause. And so that's the example of Washington. Well, 15 years later, Washington was back in that same part of the country where he had the battle 15 years. Now, time of peace, but Washington's back, and now the states look like they kind of do now. And the battle was fought at a place called Fort Duquesne, which today we call Pittsburgh. So he's back in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And when he's there, several Indian chiefs come to him and say, we want to meet with you. We want to sit down and have a council fire with you. And they did. And two of the chiefs said, you don't know us. He said, but we know you. He said, 15 years ago, we fought against you in this woods right here. And so one of the older chiefs said, I told my braves to fire at you, and we singled you out. And this is what he told Washington. This is what he testified. He said, I called to my young men and said, quick, let your aim be certain, and he dies. Our rifles were leveled, rifles which, but for you, knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. He said, the power mightier far than we shielded you. I'm come to pay homage to the man who's the particular favorite of heaven, who can never die in battle. So this Indian chief says, we singled you out, and we shot you so many times, and you just wouldn't die. Another chief did the same thing. He said, I told my guys the same way. He said, not only did I tell my guys to shoot at you, he said, I did as well. He said, Washington was never born to be killed by a bullet. I had 17 fair fires at him with my rifle, and after all, could not bring him to the ground. Now, you understand it's a single fire rifle. You have to reload 17 times. You are dedicated to follow that guy through battle and shoot at him 17 times, and you can't bring him to the ground. See, this is the miracle that Americans used to know. We don't talk about miracles in our history much anymore, but this is a miracle we used to know. And this is now called the bulletproof George Washington. We have that story at the back if you're interested in it. But it's something we used to teach through all of our classes, and kids used to know the story, and we used to know God's sovereign hand. But that's one example of a miracle in war. I want to take you to, and by the way, when you fight in a righteous cause and a righteous war as a righteous warrior, again, we're back to Psalm 144, verse 1. Praise be to the Lord who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. This is a gifting of God that so many soldiers have, and that's why they feel called to be a soldier. I want to take you to World War II. We've had so many wars in America, but World War II. In World War II, we start with Pearl Harbor. The attack that happened December the 7th, 1941, it was completely unexpected. 2,403 Americans died as a result of that attack. And so what happened was Japan had declared war on us, but they didn't tell us that. They announced it back home. We've declared war on America. We're going to attack them. We didn't know war had been declared. And from our standpoint, it was a very treacherous attack. It was an unbroadcast, unannounced attack, and we got hit. But obviously, once we got hit, we declared war. So we declared war on Japan. Well, Japan is allies with Germany and with Italy. And so when we declared war on Japan, Germany and Italy declared war on us. And when they declared war on us, we declared war on them. So in a period of 4 days, we have 6 declarations of war that occurred with America. We are clearly at war. We were drawn into this. We tried to stay out, as I mentioned earlier. We believed if we didn't militarize, we wouldn't threaten anybody, and they would leave us alone, and that did not work out. We, again, were flying biplanes, and we were still using World War I equipment. The training that was being done by the Army at that time for machine guns, they gave you a broomstick painted black, and you used that as your gun to practice with. We didn't have the ammo, we didn't have the guns. We weren't going to threaten anybody, and we got attacked. Now, it's interesting that when we get attacked, the president has to talk to the nation about this. And so the State of the Union, which came just a couple weeks later, this is what the president said to America about where we now found ourselves. Listen to what President Roosevelt said.
The world is too small to provide adequate living room for both Hitler and God. In proof of that, the Nazis have now announced their plan for enforcing their new German pagan religion all over the world. The plan by which the Holy Bible and the cross of mercy would be displaced by Mein Kampf and the swastika and the naked sword.
Did you hear the contrast? This is all about God versus Hitler. This is all about the Nazis versus the cross of Christ. I mean, he goes through and makes it, he said, this is about the Bible versus Mein Kampf, which, by the way, our war poster that came out after the president's speech was this. And you see the war poster here, and it says, this is the enemy. This is what we sold in America to raise money to send our guys to war. This is a clear attack on the Bible. And see, that's what we believe. Anything that attacks the Bible is the enemy. Now, we can't even talk like that today in public without getting attacked as being some kind of radical. And yet this is what the government was producing just a generation or two ago. Your parents, your grandparents, this is the generation they lived in. Anything that attacks the Bible is attacking America. And by the way, we had a number of war posters. You see the praying here. This is part of a war poster. Here's the nativity scene of Christ. And this one says, strong in the strength of the Lord. We who fight in the people's cause will never stop until that cause is won. Even the Lord's Prayer was part of it. This deliver us from evil. The Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6:13. This is the tone we had throughout that period of time. Now, we're at war. We've gone to war. We have to mobilize. It takes us about a year. We start manufacturing tanks. We actually manufacture a Sherman tank every 55 minutes off the assembly line. We manufacture a B-24 bomber every 55 minutes off the assembly line. We turn out a Liberty ship every 4 days. We weren't ready for war, but it took us a year to get there. And so now we're involved in battles all over Europe, all over the Pacific. And we start getting to a point where we're winning more than we're losing. And so D-Day is a real turning point. With D-Day, now we go on the offensive. We are going right at Germany. And so with D-Day, the landings there, we take 160,000 troops and land them. We'd convinced the Germans we were coming ashore 300 miles away, which is where a lot of them were waiting. But we still had all the difficulty with the troops that were there, and we lost several thousand troops on D-Day. It's interesting. This was a completely secret operation. We tricked the Germans. Nobody knew what was going on except the inner circle, the Allies and Allied troops, completely secret. And so when it's time that the operation occurs, that's when the president tells us for the first time what's going on. And the president says, hey, we've been doing a secret operation. We are now invading. We're going toward Germany. We're now landing on the continent of Europe to drive the Germans back into their land. And I want you to hear how the president tells the American people. This is one of his fireside chats. Total secret. It's not been in the news. It's not been announced. He announces it. Here's what he said.
And so, in this poignant hour, I ask you to join with me in prayer. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard.
He prayed for 6 minutes. So the announcement of D-Day was, our troops are landing right now. We're all going to stop. Let's pray, right? What do you think would happen today if the president led a 6-minute prayer nationally? Media would lose their mind. But see, this is who America was, and this is what we understood, and this is what was different. So what happens is after we've landed on D-Day, and the president has announced that we've gone in now, and this is far away from where the Germans expected us to land. They were still there, but not in the forces that we expected. And so the plan is that we're going to go through France and push the Germans back out of France and out of Switzerland and out of Belgium, push them back into Germany. And so we set up a 600-mile front. And that 600-mile front, in the top part, you have General Courtney Hodges with the 1st Army, and in the bottom part, you have General George Patton with the 3rd Army, and we're going to push Germany back. Well, Germany recognizes that this is not a good deal, because if we get pushed back, then it's over for us. I mean, we got to be able to hold this land. And so they decide they need to counterattack. So they choose a place up here, and they said, we've got to break through and get on the other side of the Americans, and they do that. They hit that place up there with 1,800 German tanks, Panzer tanks, and 200,000 Germans. And they hit it all at one point, and they broke through. They got on the backside. They got 60 miles behind us and turned around, and now they're attacking us from behind and in front. And so that area becomes a battle zone, and this is known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge lasted about 6 weeks. It was one of the most horrific battles in World War II. The Germans, in desperation, realized that if we get pushed out of France, this is over for us. We cannot lose this battle. So at that point in time where they're making that breakthrough, and they've come through and they've got all these troops on both sides, down below that was Patton. And Eisenhower says, Patton, you've got to go up and rescue Courtney Hodges in the First Army. Take the Third Army and do that. So Patton's in charge of doing that. Now, Patton has had real trouble. Patton is winning all these battles he's been doing across France, but it's so frustrating to him because there has been so much rain, so much snow. He can't get done what he needs to do. He wins, except now he's fighting the weather as well. And so he can't get his planes off the ground. And if we get planes off the ground, we just blow up their tanks. Our Sherman tanks aren't as good as our Panzer tanks, but our bombers are a whole lot better than their Panzer tanks. And this is how he's been winning. He's had the air support, P-51s and P-47s wiping out the German tanks, but he can't get them off the ground. And there's so much fog that when he gets the planes off the ground, they can't tell which side is which and where they're supposed to be going. And his guys are buried in snow, trying to march through snow because this is wintertime in Europe, and they're trying to fight in the snow, and their equipment is getting stuck everywhere. And it's been 6 weeks of this kind of weather. And he can't move his guys the way he needs to, and he's gone through 6 weeks of this. And so over that period of time, he keeps calling the chaplains. So the chaplains, you guys really need to pray. The weather has got to change. This is so bad. And the chaplains say, well, sir, we understand it's bad, but this is what every European winter is like. This is what it's been like for centuries, and this is just normal. He said, I don't care. You need to pray about the weather. And they kept telling him this is normal. And so finally he called in James O'Neill, who was the chief of chaplains for the Third Army. He said, O'Neill, he said, do you have a prayer for weather? And O'Neill said, let me check the prayer book, sir. I'll get back to you. And so O'Neill got back to him, and O'Neill said that he said, I don't have one in the prayer books, but I'll write one for you. And he said, at that point, Patton turned his back on him, walked over to the window, and looked out the window at all the rain that was falling. And over his shoulder, he talked to O'Neill. He said, O'Neill, he said, do our soldiers pray? And O'Neill said, certainly, sir, we have chaplains. He said, I'm not asking the chaplains pray, I'm asking do the soldiers pray? And O'Neill said, well, there's no atheist in Foxhole. Yeah. He said, I've got 250,000 soldiers. Are they all praying right now about the weather? And so they wrote out a prayer card with a prayer for weather. This is the actual, we have museums in Texas. We own about 160,000 items. If you get to Texas, they're world-class museums, come see them. And this is the prayer card. We'll come back to in a minute, but Patton signed it on the back. Now, you see here, holly down the side, this is how we spent Christmas of 1944, was in the Battle of the Bulge. And so it's got a Christmas greeting on it. What a Christmas day that was for the guys in the Battle of the Bulge. So Patton writes that prayer card out, but what happened, Patton, people don't think of him as a very God-fearing guy, but he was. As a matter of fact, Patton had taught Sunday school. He was a Sunday school teacher for kids, of all things. Nobody thinks about Patton in that way. And as Patton was moving across France, winning battle after battle, he would stop at the churches in the various towns because they're all abandoned. People are not coming to church because they're not going to show up in the middle of a war, and here comes the American army. And so Patton would stop at the church, and they're all high churches. And high church means that it's cathedral kind, and when you get inside, it's really impressive to the eyes. You have statues of the apostles, and you have statues of Mary, and you have statues of Jesus. And Patton would stop at these, after he conquered a town, he would stop at that church, he would go inside, and he would take his helmet off and put it under his arm, and he'd walk up to the statue of Jesus, and he would start briefing Jesus on what had just happened. He said, now, sir, here's what we did this week. We were able to take this, and he said, now, here's where I'm going to be next week, and I really need your help. And so he would brief Jesus just like he was talking to Eisenhower, and then he would leave. So when he got to Luxembourg, he went into the church at Luxembourg because Luxembourg is headquarters for the Battle of the Bulge. This is where Patton spent time to run the battle. So he goes in the church, and the conversation he had with Jesus was so remarkable that they painted a painting of it. This was released right after the war. His officers were all there, and they actually wrote down his prayer because they said, this is amazing. And so afterwards they asked Patton, is this what you prayed? He said, yeah, that's what I prayed. And so you can see his prayer here. This is published right after the war. You see down at the bottom, here's what he says. He says, sir, this is Patton talking. He says, sir, I can't help but feel that I've offended you in some way. that suddenly you've lost all sympathy with our cause, that you're throwing in with von Rundstedt and his paper-hanging God. Now, von Rundstedt is the German general in charge of Battle of the Bulge. The paper-hanging God, Adolf Hitler, hung wallpaper before World War II. So that's what he's calling. It looks like you're helping von Rundstedt and Hitler with all this weather we've got. He says, you know without me telling you that our situation is desperate. Sir, sure, I can tell my staff that everything is going according to plan, but there's no use me telling you that my 101st Airborne is holding out against tremendous odds in Bastogne. Without your cooperation from a weather standpoint, I'm deprived of an accurate disposition of the Germans, and how can I be intelligent in my attack? He says, all this probably sounds unreasonable to you, but I've lost all patience with your chaplains who insist that this is a typical, I've had it with them saying, this is what winter's always like over here. He says that I must have faith. He says, you have just got to make up your mind whose side you're on. He said, you must come to my assistance so that I may dispatch the entire German army as a birthday present to your Prince of Peace. He says, if you will give me 4 days of clear weather, he said, I will send you more Germans than your bookkeepers in heaven can keep up with. So that was Patton's prayer. He prayed the prayer. He left the church. They then distributed that prayer card to all 250,000 troops who immediately started praying it. Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we've had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power, we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen. 250,000 soldiers started praying that prayer. 2 days later, the skies completely cleared. The skies cleared, and we have the weather reports of the staff, and the weather guys say this is a miracle. Our forecast shows overcast. We had clear skies, and not only was it clear skies for 4 days, it was clear skies for 9 days. That completely turned the Battle of the Bulge. That's why we end up winning. Now, Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest battle in World War II. Even with the miracles, it was 19,000 killed, 70,000 wounded. Had it not been for the miracles, those numbers would have been astronomical. But the miracle is what turned that battle. It's interesting that when Patton left town, he stopped back by the church and said, sorry I got mad at you. You really did have things under control. I mean, he apologized to Jesus for having blown up at him. So he goes on, he finishes, he makes the rest of the way across Europe. He pushes Hitler back into Germany. Hitler commits suicide, then the Japanese surrender and the war is over. But miracles and war were very common things, and Patton, in the same way as the other soldiers we looked at, praise be to the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle. And these were calling of God, and they recognized that just as David was called of God as a warrior and a king and as a poet and a worshiper, same with so many of these other guys. So looking at where we are, America's had a number of wars. I just want to end by going through and just reminding you how much has been sacrificed so that we can sit here and do what we do this morning. And this is what we do on Memorial Day, is remember the sacrifices that made all this possible. So take you quickly through some of these. The American Revolution. The American Revolution was an 8-year battle that we fought. We had 18,000 prisoners of war. We had some 6,000 wounded and some 25,000 that were killed. That's the first part of Memorial Day. You go to the Barbary Powers War. This is the longest war we had in American history. This particular war was 32 years long. This 32-year-long war was in close combat with Muslim terrorists who said, you guys are Christians, we're Muslims, we're going to conquer you. We don't have records for that war. We don't know how many were killed. We just know a bunch were killed. 32 years of fighting Muslim terrorists. The next major war we had was the War of 1812. This is where the British attacked us on our own ground. They burned the White House, they burned the Capitol, they went through the nation. You have the prisoners of war, you have those that were wounded, and you have some 2,200 that gave their lives in the War of 1812. This is what really made us our own independent nation, able to stand on our own feet with all the other nations of the world. Following that, you'll have the Mexican War. Mexico was so unstable, they went through like a revolution a year. In 21 years, they had 21 revolutions. Well, in one of those periods of time, we bought three territories from Mexico, And that's the Southwest United States. But a later leader came in Mexico, said, we shouldn't have sold you that. We're taking it back. And so we get attacked. And so we have the what's called the Mexican War, about 3 years of war. And in the Mexican War, the same thing. We had prisoners of war. We had a number wounded. And we had some 13,000 who were killed in the Mexican War, where they've attacked us again for selling us property that they previously sold. Then you have the Civil War, which is the bloodiest war in America's history, more casualties than any other war by far. It's 4 years. The prisoners of war, it was like the Holocaust in many ways. There were actually people who were executed after the war for the way they treated prisoners. It was barbaric. 354,000 wounded, 620,000 killed. That's the highest number of losses we've ever had in any war at any point in time. You go to the Spanish-American War. Spain attacked a bunch of American citizens and killed American citizens, and we said we're not putting up with that. And so the Spanish-American War did not last long. It was less than a year, and in that period of time, that's where Teddy Roosevelt became big, but the 1,600 wounded and the 2,400 that were killed in the Spanish-American War. Then you get to World War I. This is a war we tried to stay out of. It was a 4-year-long war. We stayed out of it the first 3 years, and in the last year we got in because Germany killed 128 Americans, and we said, we're not going to allow you to do that. So we get in the war. It is a bloody war. In addition to the prisoners of war, you have 200,000 that were wounded, and you have 116,000 that were killed. Then we get into World War II. World War II, showing you a miracle out of it, but overall, as you look at the 4 years of war, now it was 2 years going before we got in. We were not going to get in until we got attacked, and then we got in. And so there's 130,000 POWs, there's 671,000 that were wounded, and there were 405,000 that were killed. So that's the second bloodiest war in America's history. Preserved our liberty, preserved that of most of the Western nations. If you go to the Korean War, it's often called the Forgotten War, and it was a brutal, brutal war for those involved. We had Korea and China had been our allies in World War II. Now the communists have taken them over. We have a treaty that says if you get attacked by communists, we'll come help defend you. And so we kept our word and we went to defend them, but it was a very tough war. 103,000 wounded and 36,000 killed in the Korean War. Vietnam War was much the same. We had a treaty with Vietnam that we would protect them if they were attacked by communists, and communists did attack them. They were trying to take over the whole world at that point in time. 11 years of fighting, and as you look at the Vietnam War, there were not many POWs. They usually killed any prisoners they captured. There were 304,000 wounded and about 60,000 that were killed and missing in action, but we kept our word to our allies who had helped us in World War II. And then you have also the Persian Gulf War, a short war, less than a year long against Saddam Hussein. In that period of time, 23 POWs, 467 wounded, and 382 killed. And then you get to the second longest war that we had, and that's the War on Terror, from the time that we were hit with the 9/11 Trade Center, and then what happened at the Pentagon thereafter. We go to war. It lasts 20 years. In that 20-year period of time, we have 52,000 wounded and we have 7,000 that are killed. So as you look over the course of American history, all the wars we've had, we don't exist without a military, and we don't exist without a military who understands the difference between a just war and an unjust war. We haven't always been perfect, but more than any other nation that I can find in history, we've done the right thing more often than any other nation, and God has blessed us with that. And so Memorial Day, this is what we'll commemorate tomorrow, and it's an important time. And as we look back at those 1.4 million who have given their lives so that we can be here this morning, go to John 15:13. The scripture says, greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. And we've had Americans willing to do that for all of us. Didn't know us, but they were willing to lay down their lives, and a number of them did, so that we can enjoy what we often take for granted. But significantly, when you look not just at Memorial Day, there's one other sacrifice that's worth noting. Just a few weeks ago, we had Easter. And on Easter, we had Jesus who said, hey, I'll go to war against the enemy on your behalf, and I'll even get killed on your behalf. And he laid down his life, and that's the greatest love we can have. So as we admire America and what God has done, it's always important to remember you start with what Jesus did. Jesus individually wanted to reconcile every one of us to God so that we could have peace with God through Jesus Christ. End the war, stop the spiritual war. That's what Jesus came to do. And because of that, we've also been able to stop many of the physical wars that we've had in America. Daniel.